Andrew, Ronald Reagan is a giant in the U.S. political pantheon. He's widely regarded by his supporters and critics alike as being one of the most consequential presidents in the history of the 20th century. You've been watching this rather astonishing rhetorical tug-of-war pitting Ontario Premier Doug Ford against U.S. President Donald Trump. Ford says that Ronald Reagan was clearly against tariffs. Donald Trump has said the opposite, insisting that Ronald Reagan loved tariffs. Who's got Reagan's position on tariffs and trade right?
I'd really hate to side with Doug Ford, but I have to here on this. If you grew up in the 1980s, as I did at university, there was no mistaking what Reagan and Thatcher and Brian Mulroney in Canada, what they were about, and that was trade liberalization. And that became vogue in the 1980s in the major industrial economies of the Western world, certainly. And Reagan and Thatcher together brought that into the international economy. Part of that was to accept the idea that we needed freer trade so that capital could flow around the world where it was most logically going to flow, that businesses could invest in places where labor was cheaper when it wasn't cheap at home. That accelerated a process that had really begun in the late 60s, early 70s of the deindustrialization of the United States.
And the argument was that this was about accelerating the entrepreneurial spirit.
Indeed. And there would be long-term tax benefits and revenues that would come in, even if you tax the super rich less than you did before. There would be more wealth circulating, and in the long run, everyone, as they say, all boats would rise as a result of this increase in capital activity around the world. But it would require, some adjustments.
What's the context in which this radio address that Reagan gave in 1987, what's the context in which this is happening? Because Reagan seems to be saying two things. He seems to support tariffs, but also denigrate tariffs. So can you kind of parse that for us? Like, what's going on?
Sure. So it was a very specific dispute with Japan over semiconductors and dumping of semiconductors, which is less important than the argument that you're getting at. And that is, on the one hand, he's saying, we're going to raise tariffs because we're in a dispute with you right now over this in order to encourage you to back down on an agreement that we'd had earlier.
Tit for tat.
So it's really a bargaining tool in a very particular moment. But then the majority of the message is undeniably then a return to the idea that America is committed to free trade and reducing tariffs everywhere. So we're doing this to convince you to do what we want to do too, and that is to reduce any tariff barrier, direct or indirect, that we may be engaged in. Let's all open up free trade. And it's impossible for me to imagine how any Republican today could forget that was central to Reagan's message on the economy back in the 1980s.